The storm didn't care who you were or what you'd lost. It just kept coming, cold and relentless. Elias Ward thought he knew every kind of winter loneliness there was, until he found a woman half buried in snow at the edge of his barn. What began as an act of mercy would quietly change both of their lives forever. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Snow blew sideways across the Montana foothills, striking the frozen ground in sharp bursts that stung Elias Ward's face as he rode the last mile toward his ranch. The late winter air burned his chest with every breath, and his horse moved in a slow, steady gait, hooves crunching into the packed white crust beneath them. Elias kept one gloved hand tight on the reins and scanned the familiar shapes of his land. The outline of the barn, the fence half buried in drifts, the porch rail leaning slightly where last week's wind had hit it. Everything looked exactly as it should this time of year, quiet, plain, cold. Then he saw it, a bundle of torn fabric slumped against the barn wall, tucked into the corner where the roof overhang offered the smallest break from the wind. At first he thought it was a sack or an old tarp left behind from autumn repairs. But the shape shifted barely, a faint movement beneath the snow. Elias pulled the reins sharply and his horse stopped, blowing steam into the air. His stomach tightened, his heartbeat kicking harder than he liked. Out here nothing moved unless it had a reason. He watched the shape for several seconds as the wind lifted loose snow from its surface. Then he climbed down, boots sinking into the drift as he moved closer. The blanket was stiff with frost, its edges frozen into the ground. When he crouched and pulled it back, he saw a long, dark strand of hair stuck to a pale cheek, the strands frozen together. A woman, young but worn. Her eyes fluttered open when she sensed someone near, and she shrank back as much as her weak body allowed. Her breath came in short, uneven bursts. She tried to speak, but the first sound caught in her throat. When she finally whispered, her voice shook with fear more than cold. "Don't throw me out, please," she said, struggling to lift her head. I'll warm your bed if you let me stay." Elias froze, not from the weather, but from the weight behind those words. They weren't seductive, they were desperate. He saw the raw fear in her eyes, the way she braced herself for anger or disgust. She expected it. She had offered something she didn't want to offer. And he understood immediately that someone had trained her to believe it was the only way to survive. His jaw tightened. A familiar ache settled in his chest, the kind that came when he saw something he wished he could ignore but knew he couldn't. He didn't touch her. He didn't raise his voice. He steadied his breath and spoke in the low tone he used to calm a frightened horse. "Get up if you can," he said. "You're coming inside." Her eyes widened, not trusting the words. She searched his face for a trap, a demand, anything that matched the offer she'd been forced to make. But he kept his expression plain and steady. She tried to push herself up. Her legs buckled at once. Elias stepped forward, not grabbing her, just offering his arm in a way that didn't corner or pressure her. She hesitated, then rested her fingers against his sleeve, light and shaking, and let him help her stand. Her weight leaned heavily on him. She was colder than she should have been, even for winter. He felt the trembling in her body through the thickness of his coat. Every part of her looked worn down, her dress ripped at the seams, her shawl torn, her shoes tied together with old twine that had snapped on one side, leaving one foot almost bare. As they walked toward the house, the wind hit them full force and she gasped at the cold. Elias tightened his arm around her shoulders, not out of intimacy but necessity. His mind stayed focused on the next steps. Get her inside. Warmer, water first, food later. He ran through the tasks the way he did with injured animals or travelers stranded on the trail. Practical, controlled. A way to keep his thoughts from slipping into the grief he carried every winter. He pushed open the door and guided her into the dim cabin, where the stove still held a faint glow. The room was small and plain, a table, a chair, a narrow bed against the wall, but warm enough to slow the shaking in her hands. "Sit," he said, pointing to the floor near the stove where the heat reached strongest. She lowered herself cautiously, Watching him like someone waiting for the moment everything turned dangerous again. Her breathing hitched each time he moved too quickly, so he slowed down, keeping his gestures deliberate. Elias opened the stove and added 2 logs, feeling the heat rise against his face. He filled a tin kettle with water and set it on top, listening to the faint hiss as the bottom touched hot metal. He moved around the room, gathering what she'd need: a quilt, a cup, a small loaf of bread, never looking at her long enough to make her uncomfortable, but long enough to make sure she was still conscious. She pulled the quilt around her shoulders, her fingers stiff, and stared into the fire with a hollow look that told him she hadn't truly rested in days, maybe longer. After several minutes she spoke, her voice barely audible. "Mara," she said. He nodded once. "Elias." She looked up at him, searching for something in his face. He wasn't sure what, but he held her gaze long enough to show he meant no harm. Then he stepped back, giving her space. The water heated, the room warmed. A quiet shift settled over the cabin, not comfort, not familiarity, but the first moment where panic eased and survival stopped being the only thing in the room. He didn't speak more than necessary. She didn't ask questions, but the fear in her eyes softened by a fraction. Elias knew she wasn't going back out into the cold tonight, and she wouldn't be thrown out tomorrow either. Morning light pushed through the frosted window in thin, uneven streaks, settling on the wooden floor in pale bars that made the small room look colder than it felt. Elias stood near the stove, feeding in a fresh log, the heat brushing his face while the rest of the cabin stayed chilly. He moved slowly, shoulders stiff from the cold, and glanced toward the corner where Mara sat wrapped tightly in the quilt. She hadn't slept much. He could tell by the way she held her arms around herself. Not for warmth now, but for steadiness. Her eyes were clearer than last night, but the fear remained beneath the surface, shifting each time she looked at him. She didn't trust the quiet yet. She didn't trust him either. Elias didn't take offense. He understood caution. He cracked 2 eggs into a pan and set a slice of bread near the heat. The simple routine calmed him. He relied on it whenever life pressed too close. Mara watched silently, her fingers tightening around the quilt. She looked ready to flinch at the slightest wrong move. Elias kept his gestures slow, careful not to startle her. When the food was ready, he set a tin plate on the table and added a cup of warm water beside it. He stepped back to give her space. "It's for you." Her eyes flicked from the plate to his face, uncertain. Hunger and hesitation fought inside her. It took several seconds before she stood. Her knees wobbled and she steadied herself on the table before lowering onto the chair. She lifted the fork with both hands, worried she'd drop it. Her first bite was small, controlled, the careful eating of someone used to rationing or meals taken where one wrong look could cost everything. Elias sat across the room on a wooden crate and checked his saddlebags, pretending not to watch her. But he listened to her breathing, to the fork against tin, to the subtle hum of the stove. These small signs told him she was warming, trusting the food, realizing she wasn't being asked for anything in return. When she finished, she pushed the plate forward, unsure what to do next. He nodded. "Leave it there. I'll wash it." She blinked, surprised. Some of the tension in her shoulders loosened as she pulled the quilt tighter around herself. Elias pulled on his coat. "I'll check the barn." The cold hit hard when he stepped outside. Fresh snow had gathered against the fence line. He worked in silence nearly an hour, checking feed, clearing drift from the gate, brushing frost from the horses' coats. The rhythm steadied his thoughts. When he returned, he saw her sitting near the stove, again, eyes fixed on the door, as if unsure he'd come back at all. That look struck him harder than the wind. It told him she hadn't known safety in a long time. "You need anything?" he asked. She shook her head too quickly. Her gaze drifted toward the basin of water. Elias understood. He poured warm water into it and stepped aside. "You can wash up." "I'll step out." Her lips parted in surprise. He waited until she nodded before leaving. When he returned 10 minutes later, her hair was damp, her face scrubbed clean, her hands trembling less. She stood as if ready to apologize for existing in his space. He lifted a hand slightly. "Sit, rest, cold's not letting up today." She obeyed, not out of fear now, but exhaustion. The day passed with careful distance. Mara patched the torn edge of her shawl with thread from his sewing tin. Elias repaired a broken fence board. Their paths crossed only when he came in for water or when she refilled the wood beside the stove, placing logs neatly the way she'd seen him do. When evening settled, the cabin glowed with lamplight. Elias set another simple meal on the table without explaining it. Mara sat as if waiting for a signal. They ate in near silence, breaths mixing with the quiet crackle of the stove. After supper, Elias rolled out a spare bedroll for himself near the opposite wall. "You sleep by the stove. It's warmer." Her eyes followed every movement, waiting for a demand. But he laid down with his back to her, hands folded on his chest. For the first time since he'd found her, Mara relaxed enough to let out a slow exhale. That night the wind scraped hard against the walls, but inside the cabin held steady. It was the first quiet shelter either of them had shared in a long time. Morning came brittle and pale. The storm had eased during the night, leaving the ranch buried beneath a thick white layer that creaked faintly under every step. When Elias stepped outside at dawn, the air felt sharper than the day before, almost glassy against his skin, and the horizon glowed a thin, cold blue that hinted at clearer weather. He closed the door gently so the sound wouldn't startle Mara. She needed calm. He could see that in every way she watched the world. He crossed the yard with slow, steady movements, brushing snow from the trough and checking the barn doors for ice build-up. His hands worked out of habit. Years of tending the place alone had turned these chores into muscle memory, and the silence felt familiar, predictable, grounding. Inside the cabin, Mara sat up from her quilt, pulling it tighter around her shoulders as she looked around the small room. The warmth from the stove was fading, so she added 2 logs, watching the flames catch slowly. It felt strange to be indoors without someone hovering over her, waiting for her to fail or to owe them something. She listened for Elias's footsteps, unsure whether he'd want her to do anything or whether she should stay out of the way. She stood anyway, moving carefully because her legs were still stiff from the cold and the fear of the last several days. When she opened the door to step outside, Elias was already heading back toward the house. He didn't look surprised to see her awake. "You're up," he said quietly. She nodded, wrapping the quilt around herself like a makeshift coat. "Didn't sleep much." "Storm's past for now." He glanced at her shoes, still tied together at the seams with fraying twine. "You shouldn't walk far in those." "I'll manage," she said, though she wasn't sure she believed it. He didn't argue. Instead, he opened the door wider for her to enter first. When she stepped inside, she hesitated, bothered by the feeling that she should earn the right to walk through a man's door. But Elias didn't demand anything. He didn't even look at her as he brushed snow off his coat and hung it near the stove. Without a word, he took a small hatchet and went back out to split wood. Mara watched him through the window. His movements were slow and deliberate, each swing controlled, the wood splitting cleanly under the blade. He didn't move like someone trying to impress or intimidate. He worked like someone who needed the routine to keep order in his own mind. She understood that feeling. After a few minutes, she stepped outside again, keeping the quilt wrapped around her like armor. She moved to the chicken coop, brushing snow from the roof and gently opening the small door. The hens shifted, restless but safe. She checked their water and feed the way she had as a child. The familiarity steadied her. Elias looked over once, saw what she was doing, and said nothing. She felt a small sense of relief, no reprimand, no suspicion, just quiet acknowledgement. When she carried a couple of eggs back toward the cabin, he walked past her hauling an armful of wood. He slowed his pace slightly, matching her steps for a few seconds before continuing ahead. It wasn't a gesture he planned, it just happened. Inside, Mara cracked the eggs into a pan, unsure if she was overstepping. Elias noticed, wiped his hands on a cloth, and stood beside her long enough for her to ask in a small voice, "Is this all right?" "Fine," he said. "Use whatever you need." She nodded and cooked in careful silence. Elias took a seat at the table but didn't watch her, giving her space to move freely in the small kitchen. When she placed the food in front of him, he dipped his head once, a simple thank you that made her chest tighten unexpectedly. She wasn't used to gratitude. They ate quietly, the scrape of utensils, and the low hum of the stove, the only sounds. Mara kept glancing at him, still unsure of the unspoken rules, but noticing details she hadn't. Before, how he kept his shoulders, angled slightly away to give her room. How he never reached across the table suddenly. How his gaze stayed respectful even when he was tired. After breakfast, he started mending a torn strap on his saddle. Mara cleaned the dishes in the basin with warm water, rolling up her sleeves, working with slow, practiced movements. The water steamed around her fingers, making the room feel warmer than it was. Elias glanced over once, saw her working, then returned his focus to the leather strap. By afternoon, a quiet rhythm had formed. Elias worked outside, repairing the fence rail the wind had loosened. Mara swept the porch, collecting small branches scattered from the storm, stacking them neatly beside the woodpile. When she finished, she lingered near the barn door, unsure whether to go inside or wait for Elias. He noticed her standing there, wiped his hands and called out gently, "If you're cold." "Fire's still going inside?" The tone wasn't dismissive or commanding, just thoughtful. She nodded and stepped back to the cabin, touching the edge of the quilt as she went. Later, when she folded one of his shirts that had dried by the stove, she smoothed the fabric with slow, careful strokes. She didn't know why she did it. Maybe to feel useful. Maybe to leave a sign she wasn't trying to take advantage of his kindness. When Elias came in and saw the folded shirt, he paused. She stiffened immediately, expecting a correction or a warning. Instead, he picked up the shirt, nodded once without expression, and put it away. The moment lasted only a second, but something inside her loosened. It felt like the first warm breath inside a freezing room. Their routines had begun to overlap, not from obligation, but from the quiet understanding that two people could share space without hurting each other. And for Mara, that was something she hadn't felt in years. Night settled heavily over the foothills, leaving the ranch wrapped in a quiet that felt too large for the small cabin. The wind had calmed, but the cold pressed against the windows with steady persistence. Inside, dim lamplight flickered across the walls as Mara tried to sleep near the stove. She lay curled under the quilt, breathing shallow. Her eyes open more often than shut. Every small sound, Elias shifting on his bedroll, the wood popping in the stove, the faint whistle of wind along the roof pulled her back into alertness. Her muscles tightened before she even realized she was reacting. Elias saw it with a single glance. He'd seen men and women come through town with that same look. Wide eyes, quick breaths, hands ready to defend even when no threat was near. He sat at the table sharpening a tool, the rasp of metal against metal slow and even. He made sure not to move too suddenly or scrape the blade too loudly. He'd learned long ago how noise could feel like danger. When Mara finally drifted off, her rest didn't last. A few minutes passed before her body jerked awake, eyes wide, breath hitching as if someone had shaken her from a nightmare. The quilt slipped from her shoulders, and her fingers dug into the floorboards as though bracing for impact. Elias stopped sharpening immediately, keeping the knife still in his hand, not rising or approaching. He spoke without turning his head, keeping his tone steady. "You're inside." "Nothing's happening." She blinked rapidly, trying to orient herself. Her chest rose and fell in uneven bursts. Her gaze darted around the dim room, as if searching for the door, for a threat, for anything that explained why her heart was pounding. When she realized where she was, her expression shifted, not relief exactly, but confusion, then embarrassment. She pulled the quilt around her shoulders and sat with her back against the stove, staring at the floor. "Sorry," she whispered, her voice thin. Elias placed the knife on the table, pushing it away deliberately so she wouldn't worry. "No need," she nodded, though she didn't seem to believe him. Her hands trembled slightly, and she tucked them under the quilt to hide it. For a moment neither spoke. The room settled into a steady quiet again, broken only by the low crackle of firewood. After a long while she murmured, "I'm not used to sleeping safe." Elias understood more than he let show. The first winter after losing his wife had been the hardest. Long nights, restless sleep, the constant sense of something missing in the silence. "You will be," he said, keeping his eyes on the stove to give her space. She looked up, studying his profile in the low light. His expression didn't shift much, but his voice carried something that didn't come out often: certainty. Mara drew the quilt closer and exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing a little. She hesitated before speaking again. "You live alone a long time?" He nodded. "Years. Why?" she asked quietly, testing the air as if prepared for him to shut down the question. Elias paused, his jaw tightening. The answer rose in him like something pulled from beneath cold water, heavy and old. He didn't want to talk about his wife, not because he didn't trust Mara, but because the memory sat deep in him, guarded like a wound that had never fully closed. "Someone I loved died," he said simply. After that, being alone felt easier. Mara lowered her gaze, absorbing the weight behind those words. She didn't pry further. She understood grief well enough to recognize when someone carried it quietly. Outside, wind scraped along the side of the cabin again. She tensed at the noise, but this time her reaction softened when she saw Elias watching the window with calm attention, not fear. That steadiness helped her breathe easier. Later, when Elias prepared his bedroll again, Mara whispered, "Thank you for letting me stay." He paused before lying down, his hand resting on the blanket. "You needed shelter," he said. "That's reason enough." She swallowed hard, feeling emotions she hadn't allowed herself in years. Relief, mixed with confusion. Trust mixed with fear of losing it. Elias lay down facing the ceiling, hands folded across his chest, eyes open in the dim light. Mara shifted closer to the stove, her breathing finally leveling out. For the rest of the night, silence filled the cabin, but it wasn't the cold, sharp silence that had followed her for months. It held the faint strain of two people learning to inhabit the same space without crowding each other, their separate burdens resting side by side. And for the first time since arriving at his barn wall, half frozen and terrified, Mara's eyes stayed closed long enough for real sleep to begin. The next morning came quieter than the one before, the kind of stillness that followed a heavy storm when the world felt freshly scrubbed and watchful. Pale sunlight slipped through the frost-edged window panes, casting narrow bands of gold across the cabin floor. Elias woke first, as he always did, his body still tuned to an old routine that never fully left him. He lay still for a moment, listening. Mara was still asleep. Her breathing was slow and even, deeper than it had been the night before. She lay curled near the stove, the quilt pulled up to her chin, one hand resting loosely against her collarbone, as if guarding her heartbeat. There were faint shadows under her eyes, but her face was softer in sleep. The constant tension finally eased. Elias pushed himself up quietly, careful not to wake her. He pulled on his boots, shrugging into his coat, then stepped outside into the brittle cold. The air smelled clean, sharp, and faintly piney. Snow glittered under the rising sun, and somewhere in the distance a bird called once, tentative, as if testing whether the world was safe again. He worked through his morning chores in silence, feeding the horses, breaking ice in the trough, checking the fence where the storm had stressed the posts. His hands moved on instinct, but his mind kept drifting back to the cabin, to the way Mara had finally slept without jolting awake, to the way she had folded his shirt the day before, careful and quiet, like she was trying to leave proof she wasn't a burden. He didn't know what to do with that feeling. By the time he returned to the cabin, the smell of wood smoke was stronger. Mara was awake, sitting on the edge of her makeshift bed, tying her frayed shoes with slow concentration. She looked up when he entered, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. "Morning," she said. "Morning," he replied, hanging his coat. "How'd you sleep?" She hesitated, as if deciding how honest she was allowed to be. "Better than I expected." He nodded once, quietly relieved. She stood, smoothing her dress, then hovered near the small table. "I can make breakfast again, if that's all right."
"Go ahead."
They moved around each other more easily now, still cautious, but no longer stiff with suspicion. She cracked eggs into the pan while he ground coffee beans by hand. The sound was oddly comforting, ordinary, domestic, something neither of them had shared with anyone in a long time. When they sat to eat, Mara finally spoke the question that had been building in her since the night before. "You don't ask me much," she said carefully. About where I came from, or why I was running. Elias took a slow sip of coffee. If you want to tell me, you will. And if I don't, then you won't. She studied his face, searching for judgment or expectation. Finding neither unsettled her more than she expected. Most men want answers, she said. They want to know what they're getting into. I'm not getting into anything, he replied calmly. I'm just letting someone stay warm. That landed harder than any promise would have. After breakfast, Elias gathered his tools. I need to check a line of traps near the creek. It's a bit of a walk. You can stay here or come along if you want the air. Mara hesitated. The thought of being alone in a stranger's cabin made her chest tighten. But the thought of walking into the woods with a man she barely knew did too. I'll come, she said quietly. He handed her a spare coat, old, thick, and too large but warm. She slid into it, sleeves hanging past her wrists, and pulled the collar up around her neck. It smelled faintly of wood smoke and leather. They walked side by side through the snow, their boots crunching in uneven rhythm. The land opened into a shallow valley, where a narrow creek cut through ice and reeds. Elias moved with steady confidence, marking the path without looking back too often, but always slowing when he realized Mara was struggling to keep up. You don't have to pretend your legs aren't tired, he said gently. She huffed out a small laugh. You're the first man I've met who says that. They reached the traps. One held a rabbit, already still. Elias worked quickly, respectfully, murmuring something under his breath that sounded like a quiet thanks. Mara watched, her expression unreadable. You okay? He asked. She nodded. I've seen worse. He believed her. On the walk back, the wind picked up, carrying the faint sound of distant voices. Mara froze. Her hand shot out, gripping Elias's sleeve so hard her knuckles went white. Her breathing turned shallow, her eyes scanning the tree line. Men, she whispered. I hear men. Elias listened. The voices were faint but real, 2, maybe 3, carried by the wind from the far ridge. Hunters, maybe, he said. Or trappers. They're looking for me, she said with sudden certainty. Panic surged through her like a physical force. I shouldn't have come. I shouldn't have stayed. I put you in danger. He turned to face her fully. Mara, look at me. She did, barely. No one here knows you're with me, he said steadily. And even if they were looking, they're still far off. You're safe. Right now, you're safe. Her grip on his sleeve didn't loosen, but her breathing slowed by a fraction. Let's head back, he said. Quietly. They moved through the trees with careful steps. The voices faded as the wind shifted, but Mara didn't relax until the cabin door was shut and barred behind them. She sank onto a chair, shaking. I brought trouble to your door, she said hoarsely. Elias crouched in front of her, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel his presence anchoring the room. Whatever you're running from, he said, you're not facing it alone here. Tears welled before she could stop them. No one had said that to her before. Not once. That night the storm clouds returned, heavy and low. Mara sat near the stove, staring into the fire, her thoughts tangled with fear and gratitude and a fragile, terrifying sense of hope. You don't have to stay forever, Elias said quietly from across the room. But you can stay as long as you need. She nodded, her voice too unsteady to answer. Outside, the wind rose again. Inside, 2 wounded people sat in the glow of a shared fire, both knowing that whatever was coming next would change everything.